Welcome to the Cybersecurity Simplified podcast, where we take the mystery out of today's top security threats and solutions. With K-12 schools going digital, they are in the crosshairs for cyber criminals. Why are they such easy prey? And what is being done to stop it? To answer these questions, we've invited K-12 cybersecurity expert Doug Levin. He's the national director at K-12 SIX to break it down. K-12 SIX is the only national nonprofit solely focused on K-12 cybersecurity, offering crucial threat intelligence and support to these vulnerable institutions. Stay tuned to hear Doug's take on why our schools are at risk, the messy state of cybersecurity in education, and the steps being taken to protect them. Don't miss this eye-opening discussion on the future of K-12 cybersecurity and how we can make our schools safer. Well, welcome everyone to Cybersecurity Simplified. I'm Susanna Song, host of this podcast, and I am joined by Doug, a very busy man. So I feel very fortunate to have him join us today for this episode. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks very much, Susanna, and thanks for shining a light on the cybersecurity issues facing K-12 school districts.
Yeah, we are here today to really shed light on the high cost of cybercrime inside the classroom. I want to start with our audience to really understand who you are and tell us more about this nonprofit, because wow, like if you were to talk to district heads of IT, superintendents, I don't think they all know about what you do with this nonprofit.
Yeah, not yet. So I've worked for over 30 years in the education space, really at the intersection of policy, research, and technology. And maybe circa 2016, this issue of cybersecurity in schools really started to come to the fore. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is that schools have finally grown so reliant on technology that when they experience a cybersecurity issue, it has a pretty large impact. And so schools have really undergone this sort of quiet digital transformation over many, many years. But as a result, like any other enterprise, any other organization relying on IT, they can get tripped up by these sorts of issues. So as I learned more, I helped to found this new organization, K-12 SIX, or the K-12 Security Information Exchange. And we essentially serve as the ISAC, the Information Sharing and Analysis Center for the K-12, technically critical infrastructure subsector. It's a subsector of the state and local government critical infrastructure sector. And really, our goal is to help school systems sort of avoid being cyber incident victims. And then if they are, because there's no 100% guarantees in this business, that they're able to recover more gracefully and more quickly.
So Doug, what is the situation today? I read a statistic, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the last 4 years or so, data shows there have been 1,600 cyber attacks across the U.S. And then of the 1,600, over 300 school districts were actually involved in a ransomware attack. That is incredible. That's a high number.
Well, so those are actually statistics that we've collected and published on publicly disclosed school cybersecurity incidents. And so when first learning about this issue, finding information about who was attacking school systems, how they were responding, how frequently they were occurring, and what these threat actors were after was very hard to come by. And so we just started to assemble a data set on those incidents that had become public. And we know very well that maybe there are 10 to 20 times more incidents than we ever learn about. We know that anecdotally from conversations with school system leaders. We know that from conversations with the federal government, with cybersecurity vendors who work with school systems and help them respond, et cetera. So it's sort of like an iceberg floating in the water. We can see what is above the waterline, but that's given us a pretty good sense of what's going on. And you're right, it has been a lot of incidents. I think on average, we're seeing an incident per school day happening to a school system somewhere across the US. And these are school systems of all types, right? This is your LAs and your New Yorks, but it's also Peoria and Central Unified School District and all of those sort of smaller school districts. I think one thing that a lot of people miss is that 2/3 of school districts in the U.S. Serve 2,500 students or less. So you're basically looking at a school district of maybe a couple of elementary schools, a middle school, and a high school. And that's the district, but that's most districts around the country. So it's really any way you cut it, these incidents are becoming actually growing both more frequent, but also more significant. And significance could be measured in terms of the amount of data that is being breached and dumped on the dark web. It could be measured in terms of the sensitivity of that information, or even a sort of identity and credit theft, or even tax fraud instances. It could be measured in the amount of downtime affecting school districts. And so we've seen school systems literally have to close. No services online, no services in person as they're responding to these sorts of incidents. Or you could look at the amount of money this is costing school districts, right? Whether it's the recovery cost, whether it's the amount of money that they have been scammed out of, or the amount of money that they pay or is paid on their behalf in response to an extortion demand for a ransomware incident, which is obviously the last thing we want to see. But of course, if you're already a victim, you're kind of between a rock and a hard place and left with no good choices.
And it's obvious why this data is so important, right? It's personal information of students, it's their social security numbers, it's their mental health issues that might be part of their personal file, their addresses, phone numbers. But it goes beyond students. I mean, school districts are businesses, so you're dealing with a lot more. Talk a little bit more about the domino effect here when a school district is compromised and breached.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of misconceptions about schools as subjects of data breaches. One is, like, who cares about student data? Like Johnny and Susie's algebra grade, what could possibly come from that? And the fact of the matter is that you're right. There's a lot of sensitive information that schools hold. Identity information, medical records. They're going to know information perhaps about financial status, immigration status, engagements with law enforcement, information about broken homes, right? So significantly sensitive information. So yeah, social engineers can use it to phish people, but in today's sort of highly politicized environment, getting doxxed with that sort of information could be life-threatening to some. It's also the case that from what we understand on the dark web, the identity information of minors is actually more valuable than that of adults like yours and mine. And while we have bank accounts and credit cards, those are being monitored. But credit accounts of minors are typically not being monitored, and they can be abused for years and years until that student comes of age and maybe tries to buy a car or rent an apartment, get a student loan, they pull a credit report, and wham, they find out that their identity has been compromised and abused for years and years. The other thing to know about school systems is that in many communities, they're the largest employer, right? So there's a lot of adult information in there, and that's going to have everything that any typical employer would have. Identity information, bank account information, tax info. And then the other rub is that school systems in some respects are like pack rats. They do have record retention requirements. And in many cases, they do keep that historical data in live systems, sometimes exposed to the internet, which means that when a school system is a victim of a data breach, you're not just talking about current students and staff that may be affected, but those students and staff who've been formerly associated with the school system. So we've seen breaches of school systems that ended up affecting people who attended that district 20 years prior.
Wow.
Which is really hard to wrap your head around. And as you might imagine, exceptionally challenging to find those folks, track them down, and let them know that their information has now been exposed. So, there's a lot of reasons that data is valuable for schools, but by and large, they're after for K-12, they're after the money value of that data. The
Mhm.
money is what they are after. So in higher ed, they might be after intellectual property, and other sorts of valuable things that folks do in higher ed institutions. In K-12, it is just the groups that are targeting us are interested in money and monetizing those attacks by and large.
Yeah, and we see on the headlines, and we know, being in the industry, the repercussions and ramifications of even a small district getting breached, ransomware. But how do we? I mean, it is such a systemic problem. It's a national challenge to be able to defend. We always say in cybersecurity, the bad guys only have to get it right once, but us as defenders, we have to get it right every single time. So, what are the challenges and barriers for these districts? Why can't they get ahead of these incidents?
Yeah, so I think sort of like a frog, in a pot of water brought to a boil. I think school district leadership, and so I'm talking superintendents, principals, school board members, their corollaries at the state level and even the federal level, I think have kind of been caught off guard by how reliant school systems are on technology. And while they have emergency operations plans and response plans for physical security incidents on campus, unfortunately, for extreme weather events and natural disasters. We seem to have a problem understanding the cybersecurity risks that we have, frankly, accepted by our
Mhm.
embrace of technology. And so I think so it's sort of cultural in that way. And then school systems as local government entities are not flush with cash. And in many cases, in fact, their IT teams are quite thin. So you might see one IT professional, general IT professional, for every 12 to 1,500 to 2,000 users, right? And that's not saying that, and most don't have a cybersecurity expert at all.
Mhm.
And so the job of the IT professional is to keep things online and operational. And now that has sort of morphed as well into protecting that school community from these threats. But if you're a general IT person who's already overloaded with work, this is not, cybersecurity is not your expertise. Your system wasn't architected with
Mhm.
security in mind. End users are used to having pretty unfettered access to their devices, to websites to use. In some cases, school districts may encourage, teachers to go out and find innovative tools and apps. Unfortunately, not all of which are uh, you know are what they say they are.
Yeah.
um right, and so at the end of the day, it is a public sector, and there is literally no cybersecurity compliance requirement for school systems. And so we do see a very large variation in how well school districts are dealing with this. Those that have been victims in the past tend to step up, at least for a little while. And the other thing I'd note is that how we're seeing school systems compromised is not necessarily with sophisticated, 0 days
Mhm.
and APT groups, right? A lot of what they are being hit with now, granted, they are being targeted, but it's sort of the basics go a long way to helping school systems. So compromised credentials, um, unpatched, out of support software exposed to the internet, and a lot of sort of social engineering and phishing going on. And those are really some of the most common ways that school systems are compromised. So at K-12 SIX in my organization, we're really arguing that school systems need to get to a baseline of practice, of cybersecurity practice, that is reflective of the types of attacks that they are sort of most frequently experiencing. And honestly,
Mhm.
a lot of that is sort of basic cyber hygiene, probably for this audience.
Yeah.
Stuff we need to do. And I think at the end of the day, we're just going to need to have parents, have community members, have
Mhm.
teachers speak up and say this is a priority for them, and ask those questions of their leadership to make sure it's happening.
Yeah. From where you stand, and I know that you do work with CISA, and you're called upon as a thought leader in this space for education. What is the panacea, right? Well, what is
Mhm.
going to maybe not prevent breaches from happening, because we'll always have adversaries, but slow down maybe the number of incidents we see across the US where it's not a headline every day, on national news? Where do you see things going, and what is the solution?
So it's a great question, and if I could answer that, I'd probably be super wealthy and would be able to save a lot of people a lot of trouble. But let me. So a couple of things we know that are not going to happen and not going to solve the problem. So one is the notion that every school system is going to be able to hire a highly qualified CISO. Forget it. The public sector doesn't pay like the private sector. We can't hire enough of these people into roles in the private sector, though I guess arguably there's lots of layoffs now, so I don't quite
Mhm.
understand the state of that market. But the notion that every school system is going to be able to figure this out on their own and build their own program is really honestly pretty fanciful. So I do think we need to look at regional, state level solutions where there's honestly some shared IT infrastructure, shared hosting, right, where we can have folks who are really highly qualified with eyes on those systems and take that load off of local IT teams, right? Whether that's provided as a public service by a government agency or by private, MSSPs or MSPs,
Mhm.
et cetera. It ultimately it sort of doesn't matter. And I think at the end of the day as well, school districts do rely on disproportionately on a number of vendors to help them with their key systems, student information systems, ERPs,
Mhm.
instructional apps. Apps help them run facilities and transportation, food service, right? And if those service providers were uh, were designing their sort of tools and services with security in mind
Mhm.
in the beginning, I think we could be in a better place as well, right? Because at the end of the day, Google and Microsoft are going to do a much better job with respect to cybersecurity than your average school district, right? And so we do need those vendors, especially those SaaS vendors, to
Mhm.
honestly take more responsibility from school systems so that really your average school district IT leader can just hit the easy button. And by default, it's fairly well locked down. And then
Mhm.
they can, if they need to, they can sort of loosen up those protections. So, I think this is something that both CISA and the U.S. Department of Ed now are struggling with. I think in general, if you look at if you were to rate different sectors and their cybersecurity maturity on, say, a scale of 1 to 5, we actually say that education, K-12 education, maybe a 0,
Hmm.
right? So we have a long way to go, and I don't think we're going to see some quick answers. It's just frustrating because I think many of these incidents could be avoidable, given how they are going down. We know who the groups are, we know who the what
Mhm.
tactics they're using, and it's just getting over those hurdles of cost and cultural change to do things like
Yeah.
implement MFA, right? And if and it
Yeah.
works. By and large, that works. Is it perfect?
Exactly.
No. Does it depend which type of MFA? Sure, right? Any type of MFA would be better than what we have by and large, right? And so we just need to continue raising the bar over time, expectations for schools.
Do you foresee any federal mandates in the near future when it comes to
No, not
cybersecurity?
not the near future. And I think, some of the decisions by the Supreme Court recently really cut us off at the knees in terms of expecting
Mm.
maybe some stricter federal mandates without congressional action. And look, this is an election year. I don't think this is a top issue. I guess I'm happy for that. I think, be careful what you wish for. Uh, But I mean, ultimately, um, we have such sorts of mandates on healthcare. I suspect those are going to be going up given recent events that have happened there. A
Yeah.
lot of attention on water sector. Obviously, financial sector has a lot of mandates. It really is hard to imagine over the grand scope of things that public schools, where we're serving roughly 50 million
Mhm.
minors in the US, and all of their sensitive data about them, their teachers, their families, that it's okay that we're letting every school system sort of deal with this on their own, when the serious threat actors we're dealing with are frankly coming from overseas, right?
Yeah.
And these are largely Russian gangs, Russian speaking gangs, who are targeting the K-12 sector to turn a quick buck because they found that they're able to do that.
The more I learn about cybersecurity and the challenges we face as an industry, I really do think that it should start at a young age, and it's really the psychology of understanding psychology. We discuss on this podcast at its inception that cybersecurity is not a tool, it's not a person.
Yeah, we've done much more work in teaching kids to find reliable information online, about, bullying online and how it's not
Mhm.
bad and how to report it if you see something. Certainly concerns about, quote unquote, stranger danger online and inappropriate
Mhm.
content. But we really have skipped over teaching the basics of cyber hygiene. And I think
Mhm.
that's definitely something that's going to continue to bite us until we, get ahead of it. And honestly, kids are coming to school. Many kids are coming to school already with experience using technology from home. Very young kids with iPads. A lot of homes have it. It wouldn't be unusual, for a high school student to have, two devices or more devices at their disposal. If you're talking
Mhm.
about their phone and what they have available at home, and obviously not every kid, but kids do need to learn this, and there is no place where they are learning it systematically. And I think we both know parents are very hit or miss in what they know
Yeah.
or understand. There's a fair amount of mythology about that. What concerns me most about schools right now is that sort of awareness doesn't even exist at the leadership level. And like school systems may have the ability to do things like turn on MFA. They may have already paid for it, but there are cultural reasons. It's an inconvenience. And so
Yeah.
leadership keeps the brakes on because it's too inconvenient
Mhm.
for their school community. But I don't think they really understand then the risks that they're accepting on behalf of their school community.
Yeah.
And we gotta get ahead of that sort of learning curve for them.
Yeah. The strategic adoption needs to start from the very
The
top,
board, yeah, it's the board level,
the
right? And we
board.
talk
Yes.
about this, and yeah,
Hmm.
it's got to be really from the top. And I think that's what's so frustrating for school district IT leaders. Many of them are aware of this issue. A good number of them have a notion of what they would want to do that would align with our general sense of best practices, but they
Hmm.
don't have the budget, they don't have the time, and even if they do, they may not have the green light to introduce changes that that cause changes in people's workflow,
Hmm.
right? Oh,
Yeah.
what do you mean I can't get to that app? What do you mean I just can't install whatever I want on my device? What do you mean I have to stop and enter in a code?
Hmm.
Well, you're not paying for my phone, so I'm not, you can't use it as an authentication device. Like, you do realize that is your data as well that is at risk. It doesn't
Hmm.
matter. So
Yeah.
this is why I say we tend to be toward the lower end of that maturity scale. I guess the good news is that we could make a lot of dramatic improvement pretty quickly if we're able to get folks to a consensus that this is really important. And I think we've got to the point where the federal government understands this is an issue, and that K-12 is a sector that needs support. But right now, mostly it's voluntary, right? We suggest you do X, Y, and Z. We suggest that if you have a problem, you can call us. Well, that's great for those who are already, well, one, know who CISA is, right? Number one. Number two is looking for that advice, but there's so many, I think, that aren't even to that place.
Well, this segues nicely because I wanted, if for our listeners today, we've got, I mean, this hits home for, we all have kids or nieces, nephews. I mean, we understand these are our most vulnerable victims, right? When it comes down to a cyber attack, like, oh my goodness, like my kid's school has been attacked or been breached. So for that sector of our audience who just wants to help learn more about K-12 SIX. And then also, like, we've got listeners who are MSPs, IT leaders, MSSPs, who want to also further your cause. Doug, tell us how they can get involved.
Yeah, so definitely encourage folks to talk to their school system, right, and ask these questions. One of the questions you should ask them is if they are members of K-12 SIX. We would love to educate them and help them in this work. And our members are our school systems. So, and we connect school district IT teams together, provide them threat intel and best practices and advice, and talk through all those tricky change management issues that are unique to K-12. So that's sort of number one. And for those who are in sort of the provider side of things, one, it sort of depends on whether or not K-12 is a market for you. Certainly we need, tools and support and help, but it does need to reflect that unique context of K-12, working with young students, multiple operating systems, a lot of different software that's being run, and for better or for worse, and mostly for worse, extreme price sensitivity, right? Because we don't have a lot of money. And so some of these enterprise solutions that are terrific are just beyond the reach of most school systems. So, whether there's an opportunity to customize a product line for K-12, be delighted to talk with folks about, what might work and what might be needed. We do have a webinar series that we host where we highlight some of these solutions. We have an annual conference that's coming up in February of 25 in San Diego, where there'll be an opportunity for solution providers to get in front of a lot of districts who are interested in learning more and going down this path. But we ask school systems what help they need and how they can best be helped. And ultimately though too, this is, I think, a policy issue. So. If you end up talking to a representative, whether it's the local, state, or federal level, let them know, like, we have kids in school. We're concerned about this. What are you doing about it? And I think the more people that speak up, the more likely we're going to be able to get some real support that will actually move the needle for us.
Yeah, well said. Well said. We need to advocate for this. Thank you so much, Doug Levin of K-12 SIX, for joining us today. Thank you to our listeners. If you have feedback about today's podcast or questions for Doug, for myself, or you want to get involved, please leave a message or check out our podcast page, and we'll make sure to link all of Doug's information on that page as well. So please contact us at podcast@highwirenetworks.com. All right, Doug, thanks so much again. And be sure to join us for our next episode. Until next time, I'm Susanna Song, and you're listening to Cybersecurity Simplified. From all of us here at Overwatched by Highwire Networks, thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, rate the episodes you enjoyed, share, and leave us a comment. We'll catch you next time on the Cybersecurity Simplified podcast. Remember, the more you know about cybersecurity, the safer you'll be. To learn more, visit us at highwirenetworks.com/podcast.